2. As part of our introduction, as we always do, is to do a preview or go over the background of the book. And as you see on the screen before you, we have the name of the book, which is Exodus. And the meaning of that word is the way out, departure, or outgoing. It makes a lot of sense to us when we talk about Exodus, just like we use the word exit. We're dealing with the children of Israel departed from the nation of Egypt, which is referred to as the Exodus. That's what you have on there for you. It's derived from the Septuagint. You may not be familiar with that abbreviation, the LXX, so I'll put that up on the board for you just in case you weren't familiar with that. It's a translation of the Old Testament into Greek, again called the Septuagint. As always, if you have any comments or questions, speak up at any time. If class participation makes the class more interesting, it helps me. It's a little more entertaining. We learn a whole lot more, so if you have something that you'd like to comment on, please speak up. The author is Moses, as we're fully aware through our study of this book. And the first 5 books of the Old Testament are called the Law of Moses, or the books of Moses, and other books of the Bible. And so we see at the other point here that God told Moses to write things down. Let's go ahead and take a look at these 3 passages that are mentioned on the slide here. Chapter 17, verse 14, chapter 17, verse 14. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Write this for a memorial in the book and recount it in the hearing of Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven." So God gave specific instructions to Moses to record this information, record this history as far as the children of Israel are concerned. Chapter 24, verse 4, we have stated for us again. Well, let's start with verse 1. Now he said to Moses, "Come up to the Lord, you and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel, and worship from afar. And Moses alone shall come near the Lord, but they shall not come near, nor shall the people go up to him, or up with him." So Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord, and all the judgments, and all the people answered with one voice and said, "All the words which the Lord has said we will do." And Moses wrote all the words of the Lord. And he rose early in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain, and so on and so forth. Again, showing that Moses is the author of this book. One last passage is chapter 34, verse 27. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Write these words, for according to the tenor of these words I have made a covenant with you and with Israel." And that's what we essentially have recorded here in the book of Exodus. The recording of the events that of the children of Israel departing from Egypt, their wanderings in the desert, the law being given to them by the Lord, and all the events that occurred to the children of Israel. So what's the overall message? Deliverance from Egypt and establishing a nation. These are the 3 promises that were made to Abraham. And this is one of those, about talking about the nation promise. And we see that occurring here in the book of Exodus. On the slide before you there, it shows that the book of Exodus covers the deliverance, but that's only part of it, because more of the book tells us about the story of Moses, the giving of the law, and the establishment of the tabernacle, and how it was to be constructed and how it was to be used. In point A there, 1/7 of the entire Bible deals with the story of Moses. And you also see it 2/3 as much of the entire New Testament. So there's a lot of information contained in the story of Moses that we're going to be reviewing as we go throughout our study. The dates. It was possibly written in the late life of Moses, but it deals with the Exodus itself around 1440 BC. And since the wandering of 40 years, until they entered the land of Canaan. So let's turn to Numbers chapter 32 to see what it has to say. Numbers 32, verse 13. This is talking about 4 years that they had to wander in the wilderness. So the Lord's anger was aroused against Israel, and he made them wander in the wilderness 40 years, until all the generation that had done evil in the sight of the Lord was gone. That's going to be recorded here in this book, until they entered into the land of Canaan. Comments? Questions? Okay, pressing right on. This is a quote for us from Brother Mike Willis, again stating that the most likely date of this book is 1440 BC. This date is derived from the statement of 1 Kings 6:1, which states the building of the temple in the 480th year after the exodus from Egypt. The reign of Solomon is generally given as approximately 960 BC, making the exodus at 1440 BC. The statement in Exodus 20, verse 40, relates that captivity lasted 430 years, making the time of Abraham approximately 1900 BC. So again, this is where we get that date, the 1440 BC. Okay. The years that are covered, we have for us here about 360 years from the death of Joseph, which we had stated for us at the end of at the end of Genesis, to the building of the tabernacle and instructions given. There's a gap of 300 years from the death of Joseph to the birth of Moses, and from the departure to the end of the book is approximately 1 year. So this is the years that are being covered by the book that we're going to be studying this trimester. As always, when we have our studies, we try to present outlines that can help you in your study and outline the book if you choose to do that. So we see here that chapters 1 through 18 deal with the Exodus itself. Chapters 1 through 4 is projected through Moses. Their departure, their exodus was obstructed by Pharaoh. We're very familiar with that story. And chapters 5 through 11. And again, it was affected by Jehovah in chapters 12 through 18, the things that God did. And in chapters 19 through 24, we have the law being given to the children of Israel. And this would probably be good for you, Mark, in your Bibles. Chapters 19 through 20 deal with moral laws that are being given to them for them to live a moral life. Chapters 21 through 23 deal with the social life and how they were to conduct themselves in their day-to-day living and their social lives. And then in chapter 24 deals with religious ordinances that were given to them, how to conduct themselves in their religious lives. Finally, in chapters 25 through 40, we deal with the tabernacle. The design is dealt with in chapters 25 through 31. How its building was delayed in verses 32 through 30, or chapters 32 through 34, and when it was completed in chapters 35 through 40. I see some of you writing that all down, so I'll just leave that up there for a couple minutes. So we're going to be covering a lot of territory when we go through this trimester in the study of the book of Exodus. If you need this later, let me know. I'll provide you with a copy of my slides, so where you can write those down if you so desire. Another way to break the book up into two sections. Chapters 1 through 18 dealing with history, and 19 through 40 dealing with giving the law. Much easier outline, not as much to say there. Any comments? Okay. One more slide before we get into the meat of the lesson. This is a map that shows you the approximate path that the children of Israel took from their departure from the nation of Egypt till they arrived in the land of Canaan. So we see that's a rather lengthy trip. We know from a reading that we just did a moment ago that the Lord made them wander for 40 years because of their disobedience, which, if they had taken a direct path from here to here, it wouldn't have took as long as it took. But the Lord made them wander in the desert for 40 years until the generation that was living at that time, they all passed. Again, this is familiar information to us from our studies, and this is probably one of the well-known stories that we learn as children about the Exodus and the miracles that were performed, and how Pharaoh treated the children of Israel, and how they wandered in the wilderness, and so on and so forth. Any comments before we go forward? All right. Let's get into our Bibles now, and that's where I'd rather be, is studying from our Bibles instead of me up here lecturing from you. So turn to Exodus chapter 1. Again, we use this outline that we have before us on the screen. In Exodus chapter 1, verses 1 through 7, we'll have that titled as the number grew. Now, as we begin here in verse 1, we see that the names of the children of Israel who came to Egypt, each man according to the household, his household came with Jacob. And we have names listed in verses 1 through 4 and 5. And who were these individuals? Okay, 12 sons of Jacob. I heard somebody else say something. Same thing? Okay. Where did we have these enumerated for us before? Yeah, we just looked at that last week, or a couple weeks ago, where the sons were named, some of their characteristics were described, and some we were told what they would be in their vocation, in their lives, and their descendants. So this was the 12 sons of Jacob, and that was in Genesis 49 where those 12 individuals were called out, and they were referred to as the 12 tribes of Israel in verse 28 of Genesis chapter 49. So we have these names repeated for us here in Exodus chapter 1. And we see in verse 5 one that is called out specifically, and it says, and those who were descendants of Jacob were 70 persons, for Joseph was in Egypt already. So we see when Jacob and his sons and all the family comes together, we have a number given to us of the number of descendants that were there. That was how many? 7. Okay, now remember that's a significant number for us to remember as we go throughout the study, because again, remember that we're looking at the nation promise that was given to Abraham and repeated for us. So in verse 5, we see that Joseph is mentioned by name, and we know that he had how many sons? He had 2. Do you remember their names? Ephraim and Manasseh, and that's in Genesis chapter 44, verse 45. And what do we know about those 2 sons and their relationship with Jacob? Right, he took them as his own. Let's turn to, again, to give us a little review. Genesis chapter 48. In verse 1. Genesis 48, verse 1. Now it came to pass after these things that Joseph was told, indeed your father is sick. He took with him his 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. And if you drop down to verse 5, if you drop down to verse 3, you see Jacob talking to Joseph. And he says there in the following, in verse 4, behold, I will make you fruitful and multiply you, and I will make you a multitude of people, and give this land to your descendants after you, and as an everlasting possession. And now your 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, who were born to you in the land of Egypt, before I came to you in Egypt are mine. As Reuben and Simeon, they shall be mine. So who's Reuben and Simeon? Two older brothers of Joseph, two sons of Jacob. So Jacob is treating these two sons of Joseph as his own. So in our phrase today, he's adopting them, bringing them into his family to be as if they were his own. So we see again at number 7, when all this family, extended family, is brought into the land of Egypt. Verse 6, we see that Joseph dies, all his brothers dies, and every one of that generation dies. That's what we have revealed for us in verse 6. But in verse 7, we see that we have described for us, again, remember the nation promise. The children of Israel are described as being what? There are several descriptive words. Fruitful, mighty, and they increased abundantly. They multiplied. So much so it's described as they filled the land. So again, you can see from this one verse that the Lord is with them, He is blessing them, and they're multiplying exceedingly great. Again, that gets us back to the nation promise that was provided for us in several references in Genesis. In previous classes, we tied multiple passages of scriptures where that promise was given. And if you weren't here in the class, it's probably good for us to review that. Let's just review those. There's 4 references that you could go to. And we tried to string those together. In Genesis chapter 12, verse 2, the Lord is saying to Abram here in verse 2, sometimes I have difficulty finding where a verse begins in my Bible because it doesn't have a number in the verse and another number in the verse. They're dispersed within the passage. So for some reason I'm having difficulty picking out a 2 here. I'll just start in verse 1. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house to a land I will show you, and I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great." So we see Genesis 12, verse 2 is the first passage. 13:16 is the next. "And I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if a man could number the dust of the earth, then your descendants also could be numbered." Another passage, the next passage is 15, verse 5. "Then he brought him outside and said, 'Look now toward heaven and count the stars, if you're able to number them.' And he said to him, 'So shall your descendants be.'" And the final passage is chapter 22, verse 17. "Blessing, I will bless you, and multiplying, I will multiply your descendants as the stars of heaven and the sand which is on the seashore. And your descendants shall possess the gates of their enemies." So we have these 4 references in Genesis that talk to us about this nation promise. We see that being fulfilled here in the first chapter of Exodus, so the beginning of that fulfillment, where they're multiplying, they're increasing greatly, as if they were filling the land. That's how quickly they are growing in population. So in your past studies and in thinking about this nation promise again, we know that God is with them here. They started out at 70. What do they end up being when they depart? Do you remember? 600,000 men. Okay? You might want to record that too. That's in chapter 12, verse 37 of Exodus, where it talks about the population when they were about to, or on their departure from the land of Egypt. Then the children of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot, besides the children. So we don't have the number in this crowd of 600,000 men, wives, and children. You know, if you do a little math, we could guesstimate between 2 and 3 million is how much they multiplied in the land while they were there in the land of Egypt. So on their exodus, they were quite a large crowd. They were quite a large multitude. Any comments or questions up to this point?
You were talking about the book, yes, there were. Jacob takes 2 sons of children for his own, and they will take the place of the city of the Levites, remember, Shemarites, where they slaughtered them.
Right.
When he blessed them, he was going to lead them out. Later on, you'll see that these 2 sons of Joseph, his daddy did was trying to give them.
Yes. Exactly. And we saw that last week. Thanks for the reminder.
I wasn't here last week, I was teaching class, but
Okay.
I'm sorry, brother.
Well, I'm not. I appreciate it. Okay, so again, at this time, you know, the children of Israel seemed to be living in peace with the Egyptians in the land at that time. But then the new king comes into town, and that's what we have recorded for us in verse 8. It says they didn't know Joseph, or probably the things that Joseph had accomplished for Pharaoh, the previous Pharaoh before that. And this new king says, look at the people. They're becoming so many that they're going to become more mighty than we are, in verse 9. So he's concerned about this population growth. And what was his major concerns as we go for us in verse 10?
He was concerned about the male children when they grew up, they would join some army or against them and things. So he was wanting to take them out as they were born.
Okay, that comes. So he's looking at this great multitude of people, and he's afraid that they're going to turn on the nation of Egypt and join some other nation or army and try to defeat them and essentially take over. Again, verse 9. The children of Israel are more and mightier than we. In verse 10, he's worried about them in the event of war. They'll join our enemies and fight against us. So what was the king's plan A? Because there's several plans that he had. What's the first plan that he instituted to deal with this great number of people and these fears that he had? Yes, he makes them slaves. Okay, again, I'd like to emphasize that before this time frame, before this new king came on the scene, it appeared that they were living in peace in the land there. But this new guy comes on the scene, and he's got a different idea about it. So he enslaves them. Verse 11, he sets taskmasters over them, and he puts burdens on them. Yes, ma'am. Yes. And they were off to segregated to themselves. That's true. That's true. So we see plan A, he does this and makes them slaves and puts burdens on them, but God continues to be with them and he blesses them. And we see that recorded for us in verse 12. The more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. So plan A is not working. So God continues to bless them. And it says in verse 13, the Egyptians made the children of Israel serve with rigor. What's rigor?
Harshness.
Harshness? Yes. Sorry?
Hardship or...
Okay. Hardship, harshness. They dealt with them cruelly. They placed a great oppression upon them. So we see they did it with rigor. They did it more harshly because it didn't appear that the first plan was going to work. And so it says in verse 14, they made their lives bitter with hard bondage and in mortar and brick and all manner of service in the field. So again, they were slaves. So plan A was let's enslave them, let's treat them harshly, and make them do labor for us, and the Lord blessed them anyway, and they continue to grow and multiply. Plan A is not working, so the king comes up with plan B, beginning in verse 15. He makes he speaks to the midwives, the Hebrew midwives, and tells them what? Okay? Right? If you, while you're doing your duties as a midwife to the Hebrew brethren, the children of Israel, if it's a boy, you put it to death. If it's a girl, you let it live. So that's the way that this new king, plan B, is population control. Take out the males so that their population will decrease. Did the midwives cooperate? No, they didn't. And the scripture tells us why didn't they?
They feared God.
They feared God. Okay? They were essentially instructed to commit murder. Just a side note to come to present day. We have the same thing playing out in our own country, or the attempt to be able to do that. So that this plan B is kill the male sons and let the daughters live. The midwives didn't cooperate, and they ended up saving the male children anyway. The king finds out about it and asks them, "Why have you done this?" in verse 18. And their answer back to the king was,
It was too late to get there.
okay.
It's like the chicken women, they had this shot before they got there. That's what was their excuse to the king. Also, this king here that we talk about here, it was, those Pharaoh like in Genesis, what God was with him, how he went about it. Basically, this king here does not know that this God of Israel is increasing them and has a purpose for that. So he doesn't realize
The Pharaoh of Joseph's times respected God.
Yeah.
Even though they still had multiple other gods, he recognized and respected God of Joseph. So the midwives say here in verse 19, they are more lively and give birth before we get there. Because of their reaction, the way that they did that, the Lord dealt well with them, and the people continue to grow and multiply. The Lord continues to be with the children of Israel and multiply them greatly. Again, He's taking care, establishing and taking care of that nation that we have promised to us back in those 4 passages of Scripture back in Genesis. So the midwives were blessed by God, or they were rewarded because they didn't follow the instructions the king had given them. So plan A, plan B failed. The king has to have plan C. Verse 22, he commanded all his people, saying, "Every son who is born you shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive." So he gives another edict. If the male son is, the midwives aren't going to do it. So he's making this edict that if your son is a male, you're to throw it in the river and let it drown. And that's the end of chapter 22. Verse 22, the end of chapter 1. Any comments up to this point?
Ricky, in the beginning, God had a plan. And in this lesson tonight, God's got a plan. His people were dealt with harshly. They continue to multiply. They were told to kill the males. They feared God and they didn't do it. God's got a plan. Today, God still has a plan. And if we fear Him and do as He wants us to do, He'll protect us and be with us.
No matter what obstacles man puts up, God's plan is still going to be accomplished. We may not be able to recognize it. It may not happen on the timeline that we would like, but His will be done.
Mark Willis in his book points out that there were one Egyptian there every 9 Jews. So you can see from his point of vantage, you would think, man, they are going to take over the Jews. And it's again what Mitchell said, it's God's plan. They weren't supposed to stand against the Jews. This is just another way
comes. Okay, so if not, again, Pharaoh implements Plan C here at the end of chapter 1. And then we start chapter 2. We switch gears just a little bit. And we begin in verse 1 saying, a man of the house of Levi went and took a wife, daughter of Levi. Excuse me. So the woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a beautiful child, she hid him for 3 months. Again, trying to thwart this plan C that the king had come up with. In verse 1, we have this man and this woman. Do we know who they are? Okay. Amram and Jochebed. We're not going to find that in Exodus chapter 2, are we? Where are we going to find that? These are Moses' parents. Genesis, is it Exodus? Exodus 6, verse 20. I don't know why I wrote down Genesis 6:20, but Exodus 6:20. Identify the mother and the father for us, so Moses. There comes a point in verse 3, a point in time where, she hid him for 3 months. Now she can't hide him anymore because remember, the king said, if a male's born, you'll throw it into the river and let it drown. So she hid the child these 3 months and gets to the point where she can't hide him anymore. We're familiar with this story. She goes out and makes an ark. She daubs it with asphalt and pitch. She puts the child in it, lays it in the reeds by the river's bank. She made it waterproof so it would float by putting this asphalt pitch on the outside of it. We see in verse 4 that, and his sister, this is the baby's sister, stood afar off to know what he had done. Do we know who his sister is? And where do we find that? Sorry?
15:20.
Is it listed in 15:20? The sister of Aaron, yeah. I have noticed that passage. The Miriam, the prophetess, the sister of Aaron, what I would refer you to is in Numbers chapter 26. Let's turn to Numbers 26. Exodus 15 what?
Exodus 15 and verse 20.
Yes, that's the one we were just reading. It's clearly stated in Numbers chapter 26, verse 59. The name of Amram's wife was Jochebed, the daughter of Levi, who was born to Levi in Egypt. And to Amram she bore Aaron and Moses and their sister Miriam. So here it's identified specifically as Moses' sister, and by connection here in Exodus chapter 15, verse 20, also the sister of Aaron. So we have that identified for us in those two passages of Scripture. So the sister that's being referred to in Exodus chapter 2, verse 4 is Miriam. Again, we're familiar with this story. The daughter of Pharaoh, she comes to bathe at the river. She sees the ark down in the water, and she sends one of her maids over to get it. It's brought back to her. When she opens it, she sees the infant, and she has compassion on him. In verse 6 is stated for us. And this is one of the Hebrews' children. Then Miriam, Moses' sister, who appears to have been one of the maids here, shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for you? Tell me the rest of that story. Who gets selected? Moses' mother. Yeah, his natural mother. So Pharaoh's daughter tells the maiden to go get and call the child's mother, and she takes, in verse 9, she takes the child away and nurses him. And I'll give you wages. So the woman took the child and nursed him. So the mother's being paid to actually raise her own son. In verse 9 here. And it says in verse 10, the child grew. And she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she named him Moses because I drew him out of the water. If you take a look at the footnotes, if you have a center column reference in your Bibles, a footnote will tell you that Moses literally means drawn out. Again, that's where his name comes from. So when it says the child grew, the references that I looked at said this is probably the period after he was weaned. He was probably somewhere between 2 and 3 years old when he was brought back to Pharaoh's daughter, and when she took him to be her own son. And she raises him as a son of Pharaoh. Any comments?
I think that he took, when they went to the house of Levi, both parents was of the tribe of Levi.
Yes.
So God chose
Yes.
the priest to preach.
True. Okay, continuing on, verse 11, it says, and it came to pass when Moses was grown, this was approximately when he was 20 years old, and I'll tell you how I get to that in just a little while. He went out with his brethren and looked at their burdens. That statement, what does that kind of indicate to us? What assumptions can we take from that?
He knew that he was a Jew.
Probably from the teaching of his mother, when she had him in her custody. He knew that he was a Hebrew. And he identified with him, even though he was raised in the house of Pharaoh. Because at the end of the verse there, it says, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren. Again, he was probably taught that when he was being raised by his mother Jochebed. Verse 12, again, a story we're familiar with. He witnesses this Egyptian beating the Hebrew, and he looks around to see if anybody is there and can see. And when he thinks that no one's there and is looking, he does what to that Egyptian that was beating the Hebrew? Killed him and hid him in the sand. Again, because he thought no one was watching. What do we know about that?
Somebody saw him.
Besides God seeing it, somebody else saw it. Because we see in the following verses here, he went out the second day and he saw 2 Hebrew men fighting. And he asked the 2 of them, why are you striking each other? Why are you striking your companion? And what was their answer? Yeah, who made you the boss of us? Using my vernacular. Who made you the boss over us? Who made you prince and judge over us? Do you intend to kill us as you killed the Egyptian? So it wasn't a secret. Somebody saw him do it, and it was spread throughout the nation there, and they knew what Moses had done. And he said to her, surely this thing is known. And the next thing that happens is, now that this secret is out, he's killed an Egyptian. He's fearful that Pharaoh is going to punish him for that. So he flees. He flees to Midian. That's identified for us in verse 15. So once he gets to Midian, he finds this priest of Midian in verse 16 who had 7 daughters, and they came in the dream, they filled their troughs to water their father's flock. So when Moses is there at this trough, at this well, what happens? So it's your typical mill, right? When you come there, and especially in that day and time, push the women out of the way. We'll take care of our flocks before you, and you can come later. So they did. They pushed them out of the way. They drove them away, or attempted to. And we see Moses coming to the rescue, and he drives them away. Moses stood up and helped them and watered their flock, and takes care of them. And so much so that when the 7 daughters returned home to their father, his question was, how do you get back so soon? How is it that you came so soon today? And their answer was, an Egyptian delivered us from the hands of the shepherds, and driven up water for us and watered the flock. What was Ruel, the priest of Midian, as we have identified in verse 18? What was his reaction to that information?
You wanna know where he was at, why they left it there.
And what was the purpose of those questions?
He wanted to repay him for his kindness.
Just right, show appreciation for what he had done, to show gratitude, to show, what's the word I'm looking for? Hospitality, yeah. Which would have been the custom of that day. And the answer was that they didn't know. So they called him and found him, and he came and he ate bread with them. And verse 21 tells us that Moses was content to be there with them. So much so that Ruel gives him a daughter to be his wife, Zipporah, in verse 21. And she bore a son to him and called his name Gershom. And he said, I have been a stranger in the land. And again, in your footnotes, Gershom will say literally, a stranger there could be defined as a sojourner. Again, names have meanings and have purposes. So that's what the word Gershom literally means. So in verse 23, almost to the end here, it happened in the process of time that the king of Egypt died. This king that Moses feared so much. And I told you earlier that this is where I would tell you later on where I got to Moses being when it says he was grown up. He was about 20 years old. We have revealed for us in Acts chapter 7, verse 30, at this time frame, this is about 40 years after Moses departed from Midian, trying to flee from the king at that time. And that's revealed for us in Acts chapter 7, verse 30. So he's about 60 years old now. And Stephen states this for us. Acts chapter 7, verse 30. And when 40 years had passed, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire in a bush in the wilderness of Mount Sinai. In our next chapter that we're going to be studying, we're going to see this burning bush story again, one that we're familiar with. So 40 years after he left Midian. He's approximately 60 years old at this time. So this king passes away. The children of Israel being oppressed by the king and again made slaves and making them serve with rigor. The children of Israel groaned because of the bondage, and they cried out. And their cry came up to God because of the bondage. And God heard their groaning and remembered his covenant with Abraham and Isaac and with Jacob. What covenant is it referring to? Right. The promise to make them a great nation. The land, the promise of going to the land of Canaan, and the seed promise that the Messiah would come through their lineage. God remembered all that. Again, as Mitchell said, God had a plan. And he remembered this covenant that he made, this plan that he had with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and with the children of Israel. And it says in verse 25, and God looked upon the children of Israel, and God acknowledged them. When we say he acknowledged them, he had compassion for them. He had a favorable regard for them. Indicates that he knew their situation. He knew what they were suffering. He knew their sorrows. He knew their sufferings. And he took notice of them and their petition to him of the groaning that they would have had at the time that they were bondage. Okay.